Taney had grown up side by side with several gorillas, and her bond with one of them was simply stunning. When she left, she believed he'd forget all about her. She was warned not to meet him again years later, but watch what he did when he saw her. Taney Haspin and her father, Damien, were excited to see the animals they once loved so fiercely. They traveled on a boat until they spotted the gorillas a short distance from the shore. Desperately wanting to get down and greet them, they had been warned not to get too close. These animals had been in the wild for years and might not appreciate their presence. But Taney didn't believe it. In her heart, she hoped they would still remember her as fondly as she remembered them. They were family. Or were they? The gorillas had built families in the wild, families that had never been in captivity. Getting too close was risky, or so everyone said. Not that Taney listened. As they floated down the river, heads began to pop up between the bushes, gorillas watching them closely. Taney knew the gorilla she had raised, even though he had changed a lot. She recognized him immediately among the group. The boat stopped, and despite the warnings from her father and their guides, Taney jumped out. The gorilla got closer. Jalta had once been a tiny baby she held in her arms. Now he towered over her, standing on his back legs, coming straight toward Taney. No one could stop the gorilla now. No one could get between them if something went wrong. Taney was on her own. Jalta got closer, and suddenly he grabbed Taney by the arm. Her father wanted to rush forward, but he knew it would only make things worse if he startled the gorilla. Was this how it would end? Taney had spent her life loving gorillas. Would one of them injure her now? She couldn't believe her childhood best friend would hurt her, but it really looked like he might. Was their friendship over? The unusual bond between Taney and Jalta had started as a result of her father Damien's mission to save animals. To achieve that, he had founded the Aspen Foundation. They worked hard to rescue animals, especially gorillas, and return them to the wild. They also owned the Howlett Zoo in Canterbury, where animals that couldn't be rehabilitated were cared for. It's safe to say Taney and her siblings had a magical upbringing, growing up in the zoo and bonding with the animals. Taney was a little over a year old when Bims, a gorilla, first came to the zoo. He was injured, and his family had been killed by poachers. He needed care, and Damien and his team took on the responsibility. Taney and her siblings were always around the zoo, and soon around Bims too. He became one of their playmates. As Taney grew up, she often played inside the gorilla enclosure, ensuring that Bims never felt alone. Having a gorilla as a playmate was loads of fun, but they didn't know it was about to get even better. One day, when Damien picked Taney up from school, he told her there was a big surprise waiting for her at home. The surprise was indeed big, in the form of a baby gorilla. Jalta was an orphan who couldn't survive in the wild on his own after his mother was killed. He was still tiny and needed care and attention. He couldn't just be placed in an enclosure. Gorillas are family animals, and Jalta needed a family feeling. Taney, now old enough to help, took on the role of caregiver, feeding and comforting him. As Jalta grew, he could no longer live in their home. Gorillas aren't house pets. It was time for him to move to the zoo. Thankfully, Bims was waiting to welcome Jalta to the enclosure. They needed to be careful though, because Bims, being much bigger, could seriously injure Jalta if he didn't want to be friends. They introduced the two gorillas through a gate, and after touching faces and playing, Bims showed surprising gentleness. Before long, they were allowed to be together, and they became instant friends. Both gorillas adored Taney, and soon she was allowed to play with them again. Despite their bond, convincing the public that it was safe was challenging. Taney was used to going into the gorilla enclosure whenever she wanted, but when a photography team visited the zoo, their footage didn't go over well. The public was furious that Taney and the other children were allowed to interact with the gorillas without safety measures. The zoo received a warning, and from then on, Taney could only see Jalta and Bims through the glass of their enclosure. It was a sad time for both Taney and the gorillas. They didn't understand why they couldn't play with her anymore, and every day after school, Tani would sit by the glass, placing her hand on it while Jalta mirrored her on the other side. They desperately wanted to touch her. Eventually, interactions with the gorillas were limited even more as they began preparing Jalta and Bims for life in the wild. Though it was tough, Tani understood they needed to return to where they belonged. Damien and his team trained the gorillas for months until they were ready to be released into a sanctuary in Gabon, Africa. Tani said her goodbyes, hugging both Jalta and Bims before they were loaded onto a vehicle for their journey back to the wild. Years passed, and though Damien went to check on them once, Tani hadn't seen her old friends in over a decade. The gorillas had fully adapted to life in the wild, and Tani was advised not to try and see them again. Yet when Damien had a health scare and planned another trip to Africa, Tani insisted on going with him. No one thought the gorillas would remember her, and they warned her that seeing them might ruin her memories. But Tani didn't care. She needed to see them for herself. The journey was long, but when they finally arrived in Gabon and took a small boat down the river to search for the gorillas, they spotted familiar faces in the trees. Jalta and Bims were watching them. Tani gasped. The gorillas had changed a lot, but she recognized them instantly. When Jalta grabbed her with his powerful hands, her knees buckled in terror, but then she saw it, recognition in his eyes. Jalta gently placed his head against hers, just as he had done years ago. She stroked his head as she used to when he was scared, and Jalta softly rubbed her arms, saying hello in his own way. Bims soon joined them, stroking Tani's face with one finger. Damien approached, and the two gorillas playfully jumped on him, clearly remembering their old friend. The guides were shocked by how quickly the gorillas reverted to their affectionate behavior. The bond between Tani and the animals was undeniable. When it was time to leave, the gorillas moaned softly, not wanting to lose their best friend again. Tani cried as she said goodbye, knowing this might be the last time she would see them. Jalta pressed his head against her chest, and she kissed the top of his head, telling him she loved him before boarding the boat. Tani would forever be grateful that she hadn't listened to those who tried to stop her from going. The bond she had with Jalta and Bims had stood the test of time and distance. It was a beautiful reminder of the special connections that can exist between species. Would you ever try to reunite with a wild animal you knew as a baby after years apart? Do you think animals remember their first families? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.